Behind schedule here. Okay. Sorry for our being behind schedule. Welcome to the discussion session of Tuesday, January 24th, 2023. We'll start with item 1, Manager McGill, a review of the agenda for tonight's commission meeting.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tonight's agenda, we will have a public hearing on an ordinance to amend the Mountain Code to include our newly enacted ordinances or amendments to existing ordinances enacted since January 25th, 2022. This is the codification that we do every year. We'll have the introduction of an ordinance amending the administrative code to restructure the municipalities, boards, and authorities. We've talked about that several times during the discussion session. We'll also have the consideration of a resolution approving an intergovernmental cooperation agreement. That is the agreement that we've talked about with Dormont to provide some accounts payable and payroll services to them. We will have the consideration of a resolution regarding a traffic signal maintenance agreement with PennDOT. The resolution is required as part of the Green Light Go grant application that we will be submitting that you heard about at the last discussion session from Mike Abrams from Gateway. We'll also have the consideration for the renewal of the backwater valve maintenance contract for 2023, the annual storm and sanitary cleaning and televising contract for 2023, the sanitary sewer manhole rehabilitation contract, and the sanitary and storm point repair contract, all of which you got an overview of the last time during discussion session. We will also have a consideration for the purchase of a heavy duty dump truck. That's a replacement for a 2015 truck that will be sold. We'll also have the consideration for the purchase of a 4-wheel drive snowplow truck. That's a replacement for a 2013 truck. And then finally, the consideration for the purchase of a Caterpillar mini excavator. The majority of that funding will come from the sanitary fund.
Great, thank you. Item 2, Main Park Site Plan and Architectural Study. It means it's going to on this size. Thank you. Thank you.
Great having you. All right. Thank you, commissioners. So this is a project that was funded as part of the 2023 municipal budget. So it should be familiar to everyone. So I won't go too much into details, but I thought a high-level overview of the process that we're going to undertake would be useful because I have gotten some questions from the Parks Board, the Sports Board, and others about how we're going to go about doing this and what the prospective timeline is. You will probably notice that the process is almost identical to the process we have used for the Parks Master Plan and Comprehensive Plan for selecting a consultant, because I felt like that process produced very good consultants for both of those studies. So as far as the history goes, the Parks Master Plan was adopted by the Commission in May of 2022. We did a lot of the work in 2021. There were several recommendations for Main Park, and then in addition, the Commission allocated $80,000 in funding during last year's budget cycle, the November, December budget cycle of 2022 for the 2023 operating budget towards this project. The several recommendations in the Parks Master Plan that also included a recreation center feasibility study as part of that plan. One of the key recommendations was to create a decision-making plan and target market evaluation for a potential rec center. Deciding whether a main park site master plan would be pursued, and sort of the yes if on the recreation center, that each site that was looked at as part of that parks master plan had trade-offs, and kind of the feasibility was determined that depending on the municipality's feelings and how much weight they put towards different trade-offs with site locations and other restrictions, then it could be a feasible venture. So the core project team that we are putting together for this is I'm once again the staff lead, as I am for all of our planning projects. And Swager Wilson has volunteered to be the commission champion. So we thank Commissioner Swager Wilson. Municipal staff, Recreation Director David Donnellan, Parks and Facilities Coordinator Phil Avolio, our Planning and Sustainability Coordinator Greg Wharton, and then as we've done for our other planning projects, having a liaison from the primary boards, that being the Parks Advisory Board and Sports Advisory Board, being involved in the core project team will help us, make sure we have input from those groups as we move through and select the consultant.
Ian, is it
Yes.
okay if we had two advisory board members because there's such a transition going on? I'm not really sure who is going to want to stick around for the next couple of years on our boards. It gives us a greater likelihood of conflict.
So really, the core project team's task is selecting the consultant.
Oh,
which should
okay,
be
so
done
that'll be
this year.
done this
Yeah.
year. Okay, cool, thanks.
So yes, the process for selecting the consultant, as I said, will mirror the Parks Master Plan and comprehensive plan processes that we went through, which is getting the project team together, getting inputs on what all the requirements will be listed out in the RFP. Then we'll issue the RFP probably in March, I would say. Responses due in April. And then the project team will review the responses, we'll score them as we have scored, based on a rubric, our applications in the past. And then if we need to conduct any interviews of finalist candidates, we'll do that and then present a recommendation to the commission. And hopefully in May, at one of the meetings, the commission can approve a consultant, or I'll say consulting team, most likely, to conduct the main park site master plan and recreation center architectural study. So what exactly are we looking at, right? What is a park master plan? I stole this from Peters Township. But basically, well, I stole the image, I'll say, from Peters Township.
Which, wait a minute.
Yeah, well, it's because, they very recently completed this site plan. So I
This is
figured
the
it was a
golf
good.
course that they turned into.
Yes, yes, this was a good illustration of all the things that a park site master plan includes, which is a sort of comprehensive vision of how everything fits together between the programmed recreational areas of your courts, your fields, your pool, things like that, that kind of have a specific use on them, versus, your playgrounds, climbing areas, things like that, versus your open space areas that you can use for a variety of different things. And then just the other uses throughout the site with pavilions, restrooms, parking and traffic flow, and landscaped and wooded areas. One of the reasons, not to rehash too much of the budgeting process that we went through, but one of the reasons why we felt this was important in the Parks Master Plan, when we did it last year, was that our main park area has kind of been put together historically in a piecemeal fashion. So, tennis courts have been added, basketball courts were added, the pool was put in, fields were turfed, playgrounds were put in. Without necessarily a comprehensive vision for the whole area. And there's been a lot of projects that the commission's heard about from both the Parks Advisory Board and Sports Advisory Board, and even some other ones that have appeared on capital lists that have never been funded, that suggest additions, whether it be things like pickleball, whether it be like amphitheater space, or whether it be ADA accessible pavilions or things like that, that you want to have a comprehensive vision for your whole site. So that okay, we're installing this here because this is where it fits best in the scope of everything that's there. So I do not envision this being a radical change to Main Park. Maybe there will be some realignments of where playgrounds are located and what playground assets we have, but we're not going to move where the pool is. We're not going to move where the turf field is. We're not going to move where the tennis center is. But I think having that comprehensive vision as we make future investments in our premier park facility will be beneficial to the municipality.
Yeah, or could I just add, I'd like to make sure that we maybe make it accessible, ADA accessible, but also just generally
Let
accessible.
me promise you that. What?
All right, never mind.
Get it.
And
That's already there.
sidewalks here would be nice, or that type of thing. Okay.
So on the rec center architectural study piece, and this is kind of the important piece.
Yeah.
So the primary focus of the architectural study is kind of a building refresh and updates to make sure that what we call our rec center, which is really the ice rink plus some community rooms in our recreation department offices, meet modern standards as far as ADA accessibility, as far as just kind of the look and feel of a more modern facility. And the primary interest is meeting the key needs of the existing facilities, whether that be expanded storage, expanded office space, renovated community rooms, things like that. The building, no offense, looks like a building that was built in 1972 because it was a building that was built in 1972. So it could use a facelift on the whole. I think there's some small ability maybe to kind of redesign the entryway if we need to use some of that. If we need some expanded space, whether it's for elevators or storage or community rooms, small additions for into the sort of plaza area that exists in front of the building right now. There may be some small abilities for expansion, and we can explore some of those things. As we look at, the main park as a whole, which is why I think we wanted to join these projects together,
Yes.
because if we're talking about, potentially changing the footprint or offerings of the recreation center, then you have to consider the parking, the traffic flow, and how it interacts with all the other assets on the site as well. Even something as simple as like adding a hallway between the upper floor of the rec center and like the entrance to the pool. Like you got to kind of consider how everything plays together and what all the uses are. So the other thing, which was not in my memo, and this is new news to the commission.
Okay.
So
Reason to show up in
obviously,
person.
obviously, we did our Parks Master Plan and Recreation Center feasibility study last year, or we completed it last year. Dormont is currently undertaking a Parks Master Plan and Recreation Center feasibility study because Dormont tore down their one indoor recreation facility, which was a basketball court behind their municipal building. So in December, about a month ago, I was talking with Ben, Dormont's manager, about how his Parks Master Plan process was going. And he mentioned that he received a letter from Castle Shannon saying, hey, we just completed our Parks Master Plan and issued $10 million in bonds to do outdoor recreation, but we really don't have anything from an indoor recreation standpoint. So if the letter said, if Dormont is considering indoor recreation, Castle Shannon said they wanted to be included. So I said, well, why don't we all meet together? Because we just did our plan. And when we did our plan, we had offered to Dormont to have a meeting and they weren't quite ready at the time. So they weren't sure what they were doing from a few standpoints. So, we still had an open door to them to say we were willing to meet and talk about it. So I met last week with the borough managers from Dormont, Castle Shannon, and Greentree to discuss, and Greentree, because they all go to the same school, right? They all go to Keystone Oaks. So if we're considering any kind of joint venture, we should at least consider. Yeah. So I met with the municipal managers from Dormont, Greentree, and Castle Shannon last week. And kind of just introduced the concept and talked about, we all talked about, here's what we all have from a recreation standpoint and, what do we want or need? And all of us are pretty much in the same spot where all of us have outdoor recreation facilities and none of us have indoor recreation facilities other than what exists at our schools. Perspective. And their high school is physically located in Mount Lebanon. So, yeah. But that being said, there was interest from the group in continuing these conversations to see if a multi-municipal indoor recreation facility would be feasible. So that's kind of where we left the meeting. Was we said, okay, we all have an interest in something like this. The next steps would be to involve a broader group, potentially some elected officials from each community, potentially start talking to maybe some of our, state legislators. And my sort of long-term vision, they asked me like, well, what do you think the next steps are? And I said, let's have further conversations this year in 2023, and then maybe in our budgets in 2024, where we can see if there's any grant funding available, maybe we do a more detailed study to engineer and, put together an architectural plan and a market study on what a multi-municipal rec facility would look like between our communities. So still very early in the process, but I wanted to update the commission that those conversations are ongoing, which also could potentially benefit us from the standpoint of we don't have to put everything we want at Main Park because we may have other options for, we didn't even get into talking about site locations or anything like that. It was a very introductory meeting, just to kind of see what people have and what their level of interest is. But, to give credit, Judy Miller, the manager of Greentree, was very good. She said was very interested because she said, this is a way for our sort of inner ring suburb municipalities, Dormont, Greentree, Castle Shannon, Mount Lebanon, to stay competitive for new residents with some of the communities to the south of us, your Upper St. Clairs, your Peters Townships, your Colliers, your South Fayettes, that have all built new recreation facilities, and recreation is a draw for, new homeowners. So, looking at a joint facility that we could all share in, would potentially open up some grant opportunities as well, just because it's a multi-municipal project and all that. So we will continue to have those conversations. We will be, the leading entity on them, just because we are kind of the big fish in the pond between all those communities. But nevertheless, I think this is yet another good example of Mount Lebanon taking the lead on a multi-municipal venture. So that's something happening on the side. Whatever happens with those conversations will not impact our, existing plan for a main park site plan and rec center architectural study, because our existing ice rink rec center does need a facelift and does need some upgrades to it. So we're going to continue with this project while also having those conversations about a larger facility that could potentially benefit multiple communities around the South Hills.
Fascinating. Thank you for the update and being so innovative. And
Any other questions for Ian on this?
would our existing recreation feasibility study that was part of the Parks Master Plan, would any of that be reusable? Potentially just the kind of, it's recent market
Yeah.
numbers,
Yeah.
for this.
Yeah, and we had pro forma reports in there as well. So there's definitely stuff in there that is reusable. Yes.
It makes me happy
Yeah.
because I don't know where we're going with it
Yeah.
personally, but now we can share with our neighbors and
Yeah.
figure it out
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, I've already circulated some of that info.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah.
Cool. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you, Ian. Appreciate the presentation. Next on the list, women's locker room, the Public Safety Center and.
Kevin Naglin.
Okay, thank you, Kevin.
Good evening, everybody.
See you again.
Well, been a little while. Try and,
Well, Kevin, so this is another project that was received funding from the commission. Kevin tonight is again going to provide an update on where we are and some of the bids we've received, and then moving the I'll say the project forward. So
yeah, so just to give everybody kind of a little bit of background, so this project, essentially, we're trying to create a new women's locker room to expand the women's locker room facilities that are over at the public safety building. Early on, we identified this is the second floor lounge space as an area that this could go, that we've got plumbing and mechanical facilities there instead of trying to reroute them through the entire building. So utilizing that space, we came up with the layout that you see on the screen. So we added, out of this essentially no bathroom space, 3 new water closets, 2 sinks, 2 showers. You can kind of see on the bottom here, we've got some locker space. We've got an ADA bench here and here. So that's sort of the space that we came up with. I believe we have 2 or 3 currently, the women's lockers. Is that, yeah,
Right now we have 4.
4 lockers. So this brings you, or this space has 9 total lockers. So for the budget of this project, we were required to bid 4 separate contracts, so that's general, electrical, mechanical, and plumbing. We put those out to bid. We did get back general, electrical and plumbing bids. We didn't get a mechanical, but we've gone out quotes since then because of the dollar amount. And then also during the bid process, we did review with police and fire to make sure we're kind of set up for dust control and safety, and making sure that we maintain access to fire gear, access control in the hallways and everything. So we did kind of go through all of that as well. So the budgeted construction amount for this was $210,000. The total cost for all 4 contracts is right around $200,000. So we're a little bit under budget.
We like
So
that.
award everything, which I think is a good thing just in today's environment. So at an upcoming meeting, you'll be seeing 2 agenda items. Those will be for the general and the plumbing contract because they're over the bidding threshold. And then we'll be working with staff to get the other 2 smaller contracts. through purchase orders, assuming that the project is approved at your next meeting. And then our next step, so like I said, this will be on the agenda for approval. Assuming it gets awarded, our next step is then this goes out, to get the building permits and. And I think we had talked to the contractors and they seem sort of ready to go, and we don't see any lead time issues or anything with any of the work.
You're budgeting for the but it sounds like everything's fine, so it's good.
We're in a good place, and actually this, this is a need that is in part driven by the fact that we've been successful in attracting more female candidates to serve as police officers, which is a good thing. And I'll give some credit for that to our former police chief, Aaron Law, related to, we had a discussion, some of you may remember, related to some of the, let's say, physical requirements, and we adjusted those. And since that time, again, we've been able to attract additional female officers, which is a good thing. We've added some diversity, much needed diversity into the police department. So it's all very positive, I think.
Any other questions from?
Straightforward, thanks.
Right, all right, thank you, Kevin.
So you need you have the approval from us that you need to move forward, right? You need.
This was for two reasons. One, to give you an update on the status of the project, and two, to let you know that you will see 2 agenda items on an upcoming commission agenda for those 2 contracts that are over the bid limit for approval.
Yep.
All right,
Thanks, everybody.
thank you, thank you. All right, next item on the agenda, which I know is Commissioner Flint's favorite. Total cost of streets, and I
Nice.
see Matt Rudier here, is great.
Love it.
You guys had fun with this. I could tell from the deck.
Hopefully we have all the,
I want to say thank you from the beginning.
Well, and I'll just preface this by saying, we've talked about the total cost of streets, we've talked about total cost as it relates to trees, basically total cost for a lot of our infrastructure pieces. So this is still admittedly a relatively new approach concept for staff. We are used to budgeting and thinking about things in component pieces, not necessarily looking at the total cost. So again, this is a journey, as one of our commissioners always says. And this is the first step in that journey. So we probably don't have it all right, but this is how we are going to learn and move forward and
Yeah.
try to get there. So
it's a journey down the complete street.
yes.
I don't know that I could have said it any better than that. So yeah, it's keeping in mind that this is the first go through of this, as Keith mentioned, we are used to budgeting in those buckets for all the projects we have. But hopefully, really, we wanted to get this in front of the commission, get some feedback and see what we need to tweak or revise as we move forward. So without further ado, kind of agenda running through, we want to give you kind of a status of where we are today. I know Commissioner Flynn was interested in the unit costs of all the different items over that complete street kind of scenario for sidewalk and bricks and mill and overlay and so on and so forth. So we have discussion on that. And then at a previous commission meeting, I believe it was July of last year, we had a kind of a lengthy discussion where we were mainly focused on brick at that time. But out of that meeting, I think came with the request to determine what would it take to stay at a 60, what would it take to be a 65, what would it take to be a 70. So trying to boil that into all one presentation here. So hopefully we and stop me at any time.
No, thank you. This is exciting.
So a little bit of background. This is probably old for everyone at this point. We've seen this a number of times, but really the takeaways here are we have about 88 miles of roadway in our current PCI, which is pavement condition index, or just as a reminder. That's just kind of it takes a whole bunch of things, history of the road, it takes the defects, it takes the maintenance activities, inspections, so on and so forth. It takes all that information and boils it down to one number. So that one number is the PCI. The higher the PCI, the better the road. As you can see by the rating scale there, we had 185 is excellent, 84 to 60 is acceptable. And that 60 number is kind of the key number because I believe there was an ordinance passed a number of years ago that that states that we have to stay at 60 or above for the overall street network of the municipality. And then you can see the marginal failed numbers there as well. So that being said, just a little bit more on the statistics side of things of where we are today. So the graph shows like the full depth asphalt streets, easy for me to say. The PCI of those streets is an 85, and we show there that there's about 47 miles of street within that category. So as you go down through, there's the asphalt over concrete, the 76 and 23, the asphalt over brick, 72 and 5. The concrete is very minimal. There's only 2 miles of that. And then the brick streets, they're at about a 57 with about just under 10 miles of roadway there.
So if I understand this, the brick makes up what, 12% of our total streets, maybe?
12 of the 88, so it's a little over,
10 of the 88, yeah, so
or yeah, I'm sorry, 10 of the 88.
9.8, so 12%, that's my rough calculation real quick. So we are currently dealing with 12 or whatever, 12% of our streets under 60 right now. On average, that's an average of brick,
That's an average.
That's an
number,
average.
So it's not necessarily.
not necessarily true. So there's now, what's the two different colors in this bar?
So the 57.54, that's the PCI,
Yes.
the average PCI of the brick streets.
Oh, wait, blue and green.
I'm sorry, the what?
There's two different colors.
Yeah, so the 9.85 is the number of miles within that.
Oh, so, okay, so you're showing miles. Okay,
So there's 9.85 miles
I'm totally with you now.
of,
I
so.
had the same problem, like, what's the other numbers? Miles.
So there's miles, and then, so if you add the 985, the 2, the 5, the 23, and the 47, that gets you your 88
88,
miles.
yeah,
So you can see what the individual components are with it, and then
love
the
it.
PCI from there.
What's full depth asphalt mean?
Those are reconstructed to our current standard specifications.
So it's
11 inches of
Asphalt all the way,
Yes.
no
The
concrete.
Drainage, the concrete, right.
Huh.
Drainage base,
Uh-huh.
what do we have? 8 inches.
Yeah, there's 6 inches of stone, and then if there's undercut, if there's soft spots, it
Right.
could be more, so. Minimum of 6 inches of stone, and then the asphalt section on top, and then improved drainage and curbs and.
And the curbs. Okay.
Do we actually remove the old concrete or we just asphalt over it?
Or
For
which.
full depth?
Yeah,
It's,
yes, it's
you
removed.
remove it down
Yeah,
to soil, subgrade.
Unless
and
it's
then you-
asphalt over concrete. If it's an overlay over
And you
the
just-
original, yeah,
Yeah.
then we just go down to the
And are those
concrete.
just old roads, the asphalt over concrete?
Yes.
Because this
Yes.
is your new standard.
Correct.
So,
Reconstruction,
Yeah.
yes.
so there, over the
Some of those
years,
asphalt over concrete were, over concrete roads, you found that that was kind of a way to use that as the base.
I think that was actually
that was
the
a standard.
standard, that was a standard back in like the
Example, you
60s.
Round it down and then you put
in,
blacktop.
in 1980 was when the previous engineer, Begler Ramsey, they converted from, the municipal standard used to be concrete base, asphalt over top of it for a number of years. And then in 1980, it moved to the full depth asphalt section.
No concrete anymore.
With no
right?
concrete anymore. And that, the first one that was done, I believe, was Roycroft back
Right.
in 1980. So that was when that standard changed. So prior to 1980, there were a lot of asphalt over concrete
Yeah,
streets.
yeah.
And then since that time, it's.
And the asphalt has 3 different grades of asphalt. So there's a very coarse one for the base
Sure.
course, 8
Mhm.
inches of that, 1.5 inches of binder, and an inch and a half of wearing.
Got it.
So that's 3 layers. It's kind of like a sandwich.
So really, this just shows kind of in a pie graph where we're at today. So really, the number to highlight is we're about 84% above 60. If you look at
Sure.
with the current.
84% of our streets are above our target
60,
minimum
yeah.
number.
Correct.
Thank you. It's pretty good.
So now taking into consideration, I know that the policy that Eric Milliron is working on, and I know it was before the commission in November last year, the complete streets policy. The thought is that we want to look at everything basically within the right of way and develop that overall cost, which, like I said, Keith had a good lead in here at the beginning, so it is a different way of looking at things. So this is just kind of a definition of what we're looking at here, and then moving forward. So we wanted to establish kind of what those unit costs may be over, and this is an average cost over 20 years. So within all of these unit costs, we assumed a 3% inflation, per year. Over that 20 years. So the average inflation is at year 10, more or less. And then we took the recent contracts that we've done over the last few years, looked at what the asphalt and milling costs were. And then over the length of roadway completed, and then basically tried to create a cost per length of street. For the most part, and I'll say this, generally speaking, I would say 95% of the roads are at least, they're usually about 22 feet wide. Mount Lebanon's standard roadway width is about 22 feet. So that's pretty uniform. And then with that, when we do the mill and overlay contract, within that particular contract, we do ADA ramp work for the roads we do. So that's a smaller portion. Not all streets have ADA ramps. So based on the last few years, and there are a lot of, say, caveats or conditions as we massage these numbers and as we work to this kind of complete street cost, just a couple things to keep in mind. Not all streets have sidewalks.
Right.
Not all streets need, a lot of streets sometimes have the ADA ramps completed already. So when we look at it and we looked at the last couple years of what the costs for the ADA ramps were, it ended up being when you divide that cost over the length of street we did over those years, it's about $10 a foot. Now, there will be times when
Yeah, that's not the real cost.
it could be
necessarily.
more or
That's
less
the
based on the
average.
number of ramps that we need to do, but this is the average over the last few years. And that's,
Great.
I'll just qualify all of these numbers with that understanding that it's the average over the last few years. And then the curb work is based on, there's a separate, historically, there's always been a separate curb maintenance budget, which Public Works oversees that work. And what we do there is we look at the length of street that we paved in a given year and over the amount of money that was spent to, because usually the curb work is done out ahead of the mill and overlay program.
Yeah.
So obviously what you're seeing here, $28 a foot, we're not replacing all the curbs on the mill and overlay streets because the cost of replacing both, if you had to replace both curbs on both sides of the street, you're looking at a higher cost, probably like $150-ish.
Okay.
So as you can see here, by $28 a foot versus $150, you're looking about 20%.
Like with asphalt, it's 123. Is that when you do asphalt reconstruction, do we all?
That's
replace the
100%,
curbs?
yeah. So that,
100% of it.
yeah, but you get a little bit better price when you do the reconstruction because you're doing it all continuous. Whereas the mill and overlay, you're doing pieces.
The deteriorated curve. For example, last year, we plan on replacing 25 to 30% of it, of the curve.
Okay.
Out of 100 feet, you're gonna replace 25, 30 feet. Our unit cost last year averaged about $60 to $65 a linear foot, so it was double that. However, we didn't replace every single foot of curb when we're doing maintenance, only the deteriorated sections, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Makes all sense.
Okay.
And then, once again, these numbers include like an inflation cost to them as well.
Sure.
So that's mill and overlay, asphalt reconstruction, same sort of analysis that we went through. We looked at the asphalt cost, so there's the asphalt cost, which is just the paving number. That's as Rudy mentioned, that's the 3 layers of asphalt that we're putting down, the base course, the binder, and the wearing course. All of the other components of the quote reconstruction, the stone base, the geotextile, any sort of undercutting, those types of things are in that reconstruction number that's down at the bottom. The ADA ramps and sidewalks, usually that's with the reconstruction, we're usually doing more ADA ramp work and sidewalk work. So that's why that number went from the $10 a foot up to $18 a foot between the mill and overlay. Curb, you'll notice that curb number is the same between asphalt reconstruction and brick reconstruction because it's both curbs, both sides of the road. And once again, we're getting a little bit better number there because it is continuous. We're not doing piecemeal. Stormwater, assuming we're doing roof drain, improve, like where we're putting historically, we've been putting collectors in to get the roof drains. We eliminate the ice spots. We're doing some drainage improvements where there's been historic flooding issues. We're doing catch basin upgrades, all those types of things are in the stormwater. So at the end of the day, the reconstruction number is about that 400, say 457, 460 per linear foot. The brick maintenance, on that side of things, what I would say there is, from what we looked at over the last couple of years, for the streets that we're maintaining, and keep in mind on the brick streets that we've been maintaining for the last couple of years, it's usually those PennDOT level 1s and 2s. They were the better brick streets that we were maintaining, so it required less maintenance to get them kind of back up to full or good condition, or good condition.
Yeah, that's right.
What I will say is, in looking at the last couple of years, we were repairing about 12 to 15% of the roadway that we reviewed. So if we reviewed a 100-foot section of road, we were replacing 12 to 15 feet of that 100-foot section of road on the maintenance side of things. If we had to replace the full width and the full length of it, it would be that $60 would go to $500. So just as so this is, once again, one thing I will caution is that in future years, that maintenance number obviously is probably going to go up, because we're going to get off of the 1s and 2s, and we're going to be into the more 3s and things like that. So
Bring up the low hanging fruit.
yeah, so I think that 60 will go up, or
So conceivably at that point, Matt, when we get to the 3s and 4s,
that's where it kicks into.
that would then transition to a reconstruction.
Why no curbs included maintenance, like there was with the mill and overlay?
We do sections of curbs if we need to, but typically these are surface areas that are, they have settlement, they have, they need regrouted. They have areas where the bedding sand is typically about 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches of bedding that these bricks sit on, and then they're grouted on top of that. They're also on top of a 7-inch concrete base. So that concrete base needs to be, but we have unit costs for each one of those in our
Okay,
contract
yeah.
built in. We can pick and choose what we determine needs to be done on each one of the streets or portions of the street. So we do have do we have a curb unit in there too? Or we just
There is a curb
yeah.
unit in there.
So
We
we
just
do have a
haven't
unit
used
cost.
it in the last couple of
Right.
years, so that's why
Pretty expensive.
I didn't put it in there because we haven't used it, but
Okay.
it is in the contract. It's just not.
typical.
It would be more economical for us to go in with the actual curb contract and do that
Oh, yeah, that
than
makes
using the
sense.
brick street. Those unit costs are higher. We
Yeah.
found in that instead of using the actual curb contract. So, and that's quite high too, because the restoration of that edge of brick that you have to remove to form the front edge of the curb, it gets expensive because it's hand work too. So
Sure.
that's included in that.
That's
But
right.
that would be a more economical way of doing that, but we've been using 100% of that funding for the curb maintenance contract to do sections of curb that are deteriorated on the asphalt streets before we mill and pave them. Because you have to cut into the street to form the
Sure.
front of that curb
Yeah.
as well.
Right, so I have a dumb question. Well, it's not a dumb question.
No, there's no such thing.
Interesting,
No such thing.
interesting. So the only way I've ever seen brick streets done is the concrete base and then the sand and then the bricks. But when I hear you talking about asphalt and how much longer, is there a reason, what's the engineering reason that you couldn't do an asphalt base with sand and brick? There must be some reason, right? Is it,
Yeah, I just don't think that it would,
Porous?
because you have asphalt's a flexible pavement,
yes.
concrete's a
Yeah,
rigid pavement, and the
sure.
bricks are a rigid
things, that's
modular
what we
item.
did.
So I think that if you had I think that it would sink in as the asphalt heats up, and you get,
Well, it is, it's a fluid.
it's more
I know it's fluid,
pliable,
but it
if
is,
you
yeah,
will.
yeah.
So I think that the brick, you'd get more chance of bricks settling
Okay.
into the asphalt more so. It's
Just
the
curious.
standard though, across the industry is typically
Yeah.
a concrete base.
Yeah, I always have to ask.
I think what we probably see too is some deterioration from moisture, because if you ride along the streets and you see where the shadows are of the trees, you can see that the asphalt starts to deteriorate quicker underneath the shadows of the trees as you drive through the streets. So I think that asphalt being covered with brick and sand and being buried underneath in a profile
Yeah,
would probably
okay.
cause, I mean, I would think so. That's just my own opinion.
Yeah.
But never really looked at it.
Thanks.
Rudy, did you say the shade is more likely to cause the street?
When it holds moisture on the streets, when
Yeah,
you look at some
it
of the
does dry
streets, you
as
can
fast.
actually see that
Big.
it causes deterioration of the surface, yeah.
I would have thought
Yeah,
being
those-
out of the sun would actually be beneficial, but no, it's the other way around. Interesting.
Yeah, it kind of
The more
dries it out,
stays there, yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And during our big rain events, it'll wash away that sand too.
Yeah.
We've had problems with.
Well, bricks, yeah.
Well,
well,
if
sand
you
gets
ground
under
it
there.
with sand.
Yeah, once it gets under there, or water leaks too, same thing.
Yeah.
That's why a lot of times when we have restoration and the water company's paying the whole
Yeah.
share, we'll have to put what's called header strips in, concrete header strips.
Okay.
So if there's another break, that water would only go to that concrete header strip and it wouldn't continue to
Oh,
damage.
yeah, I know
Yeah,
what
you see
you're
the
talking
header
about, header
strips, yeah.
I know what you're talking
We'll have
about,
them
yeah.
do those a lot of
Sure.
times too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
And then along with, I know an issue of way back, cinders supposed to now use salt on the brick streets. How does that impact? Is it more the concrete or it's the sand? The salt negatively impacts?
It's the concrete really.
Yeah, so I know we've had this discussion. The sand, the cinders actually did two things. One, it provided traction for but it also, some of the contractors that we've talked to, and it makes sense, the cinders were almost like a micro resurfacing of the brick street because those cinders would get in between the bricks and almost
They're like
fill them back in
grouting
again.
a little
It was
bit.
almost like regrouting the bricks back together. So the cinders actually were beneficial for two reasons, on a brick street. Now, the salt, it clears the ice or clears the snow and ice. However, the brine that goes down through the bricks gets to the concrete below and then it starts to deteriorate. So the salt does its job from a maintenance perspective, snow maintenance perspective, but it actually leads to the degradation of the concrete below. So
Now, Commissioner Spargo Wilson asked about like the idea of blacktop as a base. Is blacktop less vulnerable to effects of the salt? As opposed to concrete, or is it kind of?
it is, yeah, it is. Because the one thing with the concrete is all those joints of the concrete, typically, if you look at a concrete road, a lot of times what you see where it goes bad is at all the joints. And then it just keeps popping at all the joints and then eventually the slab goes from a 10x10 slab and then it just keeps shrinking in around all four sides. It's usually not the middle that goes bad. So the asphalt doesn't have those joints, so it's more sealed up against.
I was just thinking, trading off between one that you have periodically, I'll say sink spots with blacktop as opposed to the idea of the salt decaying.
It's back to.
It's not like it deteriorates overnight either. I mean, if you think about it, we have concrete curbs on every street in Mount Lebanon. So, those aren't falling apart. I mean, over time they will, 30, 40 years. And those are the sections that we're repairing or replacing. But it don't want to make it sound like it's falling apart overnight,
Right.
it's over time. These brick streets are 60, 70, 80 years old. So
And
Yeah.
regrouting helps.
it does, yeah.
Yeah.
It seals them
Yeah.
back up. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Thank you.
Good, thanks.
So on the brick reconstruction side of things, we came up with a cost of about 1482 per linear foot, which when you look at that versus the reconstruction, we've always said it's about that 2.5, 3 times, and it's in that same, as a gut check, it kind of fell within that same ballpark, and that was based on the brick reconstruction number. The true reconstruction number was based on, we haven't done one recently for a while, so we did get pricing on Parkway a few years ago. So using that pricing and what that would be, that's how we derived these numbers.
Just had the one data point, but it was recent.
Yeah, but we had one before that too. We did
Morrison,
more
yeah,
so
we-
we bid
We had a deal
too.
with Morrison.
Um,
That was included in on a reconstruction program that we had as an alternate.
yeah,
But we
so
couldn't finish that.
bricks?
Not the old bricks.
Belden
New
is
papers,
yeah, so we've had conversations with,
Papers in yellow?
They have different
they have
colors,
different
yeah,
colors, yeah.
yeah, but the dimensions are all different than the old
Are they?
bricks, so you
Yeah.
can't you have to do an entire
You'd have to
section
do
of
the
the
whole
street.
thing. Yeah, I
You'd have to
You
understand.
can't do a repair with the new
Got it.
pavers in an
Sure.
old brick street.
Yeah, I understand.
So that's what we run into with utilities,
Sure.
and what we typically try to have them do is replace a whole section with new pavers. That was done on Midway, section of Midway,
Yeah.
or New Lawn, and then also on Dixon. But they didn't have, there were too many deteriorated and damaged
Sure,
bricks, so
yeah.
we have them
Yeah.
pull a section out, use those as donor bricks to do the trench work and everything up to that point, and then use the new pavers in this section. So there's a couple areas that you could go.
I'll go look.
Overlooking
I'll
Dixon,
go
that's a
overlook,
good, that's a good place to look.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
that's
right off of Overlook, yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
That was done last year or the year
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
recent.
Yeah.
I'll go look.
It was a bad water leak.
So on the sidewalk maintenance side of things, so what we looked at here, and I'm sure it would it would hold true for the assessment side of things too, but on the sidewalks that are the responsibility of the municipality to maintain, which are the root damage sidewalks, because those are the ones that are damaged by trees. We're looking at about $19 per linear foot, and what we looked at there was it's averaging about 15 to 20% of the length reviewed that is needing replaced. And that side of things. So if you had to replace 100%, obviously, you'd take that $19 divided by,
Times 5.
yeah, times 5. And then new sidewalk, I know there was discussion about if a street does not have sidewalk, what would it take to have sidewalk installed? So we gave an estimate there, and this is a ballpark, the true sidewalk number is probably in that 50 range, but then if you have to add walls or grading or other things, then you're probably in that 75, or there may be situations where it's an exceptionally difficult area where it may even be a little bit more than that. But from a ballpark standpoint, we're in that 50 to 75, and then both sides would be that 100 to 150.
Pays for moving utilities. when there's like a pole.
We usually would try and go around for the most
Yeah,
part.
yeah.
If we could, yeah.
Yeah.
Moving it would be expensive.
Expensive, very
Yeah,
expensive.
yeah. So we'd try and, I think you have to look at each one on a case by case
Yeah.
basis. I know we did some sidewalk on North Meadowcroft a number of years ago where we had a section there and worked with the community there to have that added in. And I think most recently,
Utility pole issues down
No.
there, street signs, some, but that was about
More
it.
people to build into the right of way for their landscaping, that's a bigger issue.
Well, that, yeah, and if you're across an asphalt driveway, then you have to change them to concrete because asphalt can't be used as sidewalk, so.
Do you put a strip of concrete then through the sidewalk?
You could, I mean, but technically you're supposed to have concrete within the right of way anyway. Anything that's,
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
from the road back.
That's interesting.
If you drive to the community.
Yeah.
You will see, say, depending on the age of the driveway,
Mhm.
asphalt driveways that still have a concrete apron. And then driveways where at some point that concrete apron was removed and they just ran asphalt all the way out to the curb because there's no sidewalk. Matter of fact, was it the water company that came through on Sylvandale a
yes,
couple years ago? And they replaced the sidewalks all the way up to one side because they had to. The one section of sidewalk, they put back in asphalt because the driveway was asphalt.
Oh, wow.
I reached out to Rudy and I said, tell them they need to go change that. That has to be concrete.
Yeah.
Why do we want concrete?
It's a safer walking surface.
Surface, then
That makes sense.
doesn't get a slip, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have concrete driveway in the right of ways too, but it's interesting. Learn something new every day.
tried to.
So taking all the costs, we looked at, and what I will say is the 60 PCI actually, as dumb luck would have it, are all of the numbers that you see for asphalt reconstruction, brick reconstruction, mill and overlay, brick maintenance and sidewalk, those budget items or numbers under the 60 PCI are our current funding. It just so happens that at our current funding in 20 years, our PCI would go from a 79 to a 60 at our current
funding level.
at our current
So,
funding today.
we're spending 58.5 million approximately over 20 years right now. So if I divide 58.5,
Yeah, so I can break it. So if you look,
2.9 a year.
so if you look under these individual budgets, you'll see the loan overlay program is 400,000, which is generally what it is. The curb maintenance, we had set at 162.5. I think actually this year it's a little bit more.
Yeah,
But I think then the asphalt reconstruction, we broke up the 2.1 million, which we're spending now. So for the first few years, we had asphalt reconstruction at 2.1, and then we split it in 2026, 2027, 1 and 1.1 across the two to equal 2.1, and then from 2028 to 2042, we made a 1.1 asphalt and 1 brick. So just
Just
spent.
as, well, you just picked those numbers arbitrarily.
Well, it was honestly the first couple years of the asphalt reconstruction, the reason we kept the 2.1 in asphalt reconstruction was based on the brick discussion that we had a few months ago, last year, there were a few brick streets that I think we all agreed shouldn't be brick, like they're really low on the PCI, like they're in really bad shape.
Uh-huh.
And I think we all, well, I don't wanna put anyone's words in.
But you're talking about some of the alleys and stuff.
Some of the alleys and things like
There are
that.
Other factors, yeah, in terms of the steepness.
Steepness and safety and things like that, that we thought that if we were all in agreement, we would remove those from the brick pool, make them asphalt, and then if you get rid of a couple brick streets that are 10s and 15s on the PCI, like really low, it's
Dragging
gonna
those
help,
numbers
it's
down.
dragging all of them down,
Right,
so
yeah.
it helps
I see.
everything if you, so in the first couple years. We had budgeted that if we were to get rid of some of the safety concern brick streets. And just not, they weren't connected to historic districts, they weren't connected to all those criteria that were outlined. Then that's why we had that 2.1.
Okay, that's really helpful, thanks.
And we're still.
You said this is current numbers, so that was the average 2.1 million per year. That's what commissions, let's say, have been spending the last 10 years per year.
Since about 2012, 13, something like that.
Somewhere in that.
I think it was about 2012 or 2013 is when it went to 2.1.
Okay,
So since then, it's been, yeah, it's been that.
all right, so just take that same 2.1 million,
But you don't, that's a future discussion.
Mr. Rainey is in back to take this 2.1 million, is what we've done for, let's say, the last 10 years. Taking that same funding level and going forward next.
Next 20,
2.9, though, if you include,
2.1 is what we've been doing.
the reconstruction.
if you add up everything plus mill and overlay, it's 2.9. And sidewalks, the sidewalk number, I just calculated it.
That's an all-in number.
Okay, so that's what, so that you're saying 58.55.
58 divided by
Everything.
20 is 2.9.
8.9, not
Yes, and that's what
2.1.
we're currently spending.
Okay, great, thank you.
My question, and maybe I missed this in the report, is, so when we had talked about, and I understand that this is kind of a work in progress and it may not be perfect here, but one of the things we talked about was understanding. So if we look at this annualized over a certain period of time, we would reach that period of like stasis at a certain point where, you know, you mentioned like, hey, at year 20, we may be getting to the point where we have 3s and 4s, so the number should go up. If we're doing like an annualized report, the number shouldn't go up, right? It should be, we expect to get to stasis at year 14. After that, it's just this amount trended for 5% inflation every year. Take that entire number back through the 20 years. So I guess my question is, are we hitting stasis point in this 20-year period you've annualized here?
No, so with this funding, it's showing a decrease. It's basically a point a year that we're losing. Now, granted, the one thing that that has helped this past few years has been that there's been a lot of utility work that has been done, that has been a lot of extra paving that has been done in the few, which has driven that because before all this extra utility work was done, we were in that 72, 73 range, I believe.
Yeah.
We got like a 6-point bump, if you will, with the additional utility work that was done. So that being said, even if we were to 72, if that utility work wasn't done, we were still showing a decline with our current funding of anywhere from a point on the high end to, if we were in that 72 range, it would have been more like 2/3 of a point per year in our
It
current,
shows
so.
that graph, you have a graph of that maybe people want to see. The bar graph.
PCI budget scenario result.
Yeah, that one, that's, is that what you're looking for, Craig? What happened?
I was
in
gonna
2022?
show this one, JB.
Oh, I see.
Oops, this one. Is that the one you're looking at? So,
I was looking at the bar graph, but that one works too. Yeah, that works too. 2042, this is where we'll be.
so in 2042, you would have, the excellent would be 9, the acceptable would be 25, so you'd be about 34% above 60.
Yeah, I guess, so my understanding of what we were doing was let's have an understanding of what it costs to maintain the roadway at what we consider to be an acceptable PCI, because we determined that was gonna be our variable number, right?
Right.
And we'd have to come back and talk about costs every year anyway. And then to have that annualized look back at that number, so does that take, 20 years, 30? We didn't have a definitive timeframe with which we annualize that data, but the idea was always, how do we get to the point where we are at some stasis and that number is the number we would need to allocate each year? Because the idea is, yes, we might not do all of what we need to do in the first 10 years, right? Like, we might be spending 2.9 because that's what we've accounted in the first 10 years. And we may be behind for 10 years, but at some point, we get to the point where we're no longer behind. So that's kind of what I was expecting, because this is still showing like failed and unacceptable and stuff like that. My understanding was, we picked that PCI as acceptable, we have a variable period, and we bring that back to a number that gets us to that. What I'm seeing here is like, this is what your annual budget needs to be.
But even at that, if you look at this, the slide that you had of percentage of roadways, in 2024, slide you just had on the screen. And you compare that slide to, I unfortunately don't have a page number in your presentation here, but you compare that to this slide marked current roadway status. If we continue to spend the same amount the next 20 years, we'll wind up going from having half our streets being excellent to about half our streets being marginal.
Yeah, I'm not debating that. I'm saying my understanding of the exercise was, what do we need to do to get to the point where our streets are all at this level, such that the budget we have, or this exercise is, we are gonna create this policy that says we need to spend 2.1, 2.9, 3.5, whatever that number is, over X number of years to have perfect roads, or what we deem to be perfect or acceptable.
PCI.
That was- That's what I'm not seeing.
Yeah, well, no, and I'm gonna jump into a whole bunch of stuff here real quick. No, you stay there. So for me, the PCI score, this is gonna be a rolling thing, right? That's the nature of program, right? You're gonna have things that fail. And it's gonna get
Something else.
and it's gonna happen, but you're gonna have a constantly rolling exercise. And that's okay. Whatever the PCI score is that we agree on, as long as we have an annualized number that we say, look, if this is acceptable in 20 years, then this is the budget plus inflation that we should be
Sure.
working toward
Yeah.
for surfaces,
Mhm.
for our road surfaces.
Question on that, we didn't factor in inflation in the budget,
Well,
we did for the streets.
Set it aside for a second. I mean, that inflation, you have to take it into account as you kind of go forward, but that's a rolling exercise and let's not worry too much about it. But then we say, okay, this isn't right. Let's go to 65, right? Because 65 looks better.
Right.
Right. And we're all happy with that. So, okay, now this is now the number that we want to be at. We want to be at 65 overall, long term. So now let's figure out what that number is annualized and move that
Right.
forward.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's great. And that, I think this is an important discussion to contextualize, right, for commission, right? Because I personally, I don't want to get into the debate about how we do brick or how we do asphalt. We're not qualified, but we can have a conversation about where we want to be and what the budget needs to be
Sure.
and help us think at that level.
Yeah.
Right, that I need to fund this much every year. And it's gonna inflate every year.
Mhm.
Because that helps me think about, well, yeah, if I am robbing Peter, I need to know it,
Mhm.
right? So for me, that's kind of
Sure.
the core thing. But this is kind of just the starting point, right? This is just the surface. Right, because now we've got to add in, right, the whole right of way, which I think you've made a fair effort at, and I appreciate, right, what you did. But to a certain extent, I want to get it down to, if I have a mile of street, right, average mile of street, how much does it cost? Not just the surface, not just the sidewalks, not the curbs, not the brick, I don't care. What does an average mile of public right of way cost for us? With trees, without tree, right, just an average street Annually or?
Annually, what is the annual cost
for a mile of street, or a segment of street, right? You pick it, whatever the measurement is.
So what's missing here? Trees?
Well,
No, it's fair.
well, hang on, it's- yeah, we kind of have to step this back.
Yeah.
Because if I understand what our average mile of street costs right now. All right, and let's call it a lane mile for argument's sake, or a segment. I know how much a segment costs. An all-in average segment. Then I can say, okay, what does this segment cost relative to the average for our street? And then I can say, okay, what if I want to make a street one way? And I want to do something else with that other lane. What happens to the cost? Right? If I want to take out 8 segments of brick and put in 8 segments of asphalt, what does that do? How does that change the cost for this segment? If I want to add sidewalks, if I want to create a VONERF, going back to the complete street policy, and I want to have a one lane that is partly brick, but has trees in the right of way, and there's a playground in the right of way, but you can only drive through this narrow thing because it's much safer, it slows cars down, but the cost changes. What does that look like? And okay, now, yes, commission 5 years from now loves that. They think it's great. This is what we're going to do with all of our residential streets, but we're going to do it over 40 years. Okay, what does that look like? Because now I have a sense of, okay, what is this? What does a segment cost? And what is this new design of segment cost? And therefore, as we transition this segment model to this new segment model, this is what our road program is going to cost, or our public right-of-way program is going to cost us. Or, hey, we want to put in roundabouts instead of signalized intersections. How much does a signalized intersection cost me every year? And if I take it out and put in a roundabout, yeah, I know there's a big capital cost up front, but annualized, what does that change? How do I?
Wouldn't we need then to say, not just an average, because an average really blurs it to say, I need to know what the annual cost per mile of a street, if that's asphalt, if that's brick, if that's.
Well, to a certain, yeah.
Because first, the average is the average. And it's really not giving a number to say, okay, here's a mile, if it's this surface, if it has, we talked earlier about sidewalks, maybe on one side where it's the close side. It might, maybe we have with half a dozen or a dozen different scenarios, just to try and go, okay.
Right.
Now I've got a sense when you mentioned about only using one lane, like we're talking about average with 22 feet. It's only 10 or 12 feet, again,
Right.
What would that be?
Right, well, and, and to your point, I agree. But I'm trying to, again, this is a journey, right?
Well, it's like they got a lot of homework to do.
Yeah, well, and that's right. It's to a certain point, yes, we do want to have that level of detail. And I know you guys have the detail, right? You're already there. I'm trying to bubble it up higher to get to the concept level of we designed them this way and therefore it costs this much. And if we designed it a different way, it would cost that much. We don't, again, within reason, because again, as people say, I want bike lanes, I want protected bike lanes, right? We can say, yeah, that's great, and we would love to do it, but we have right now, no tactical understanding of what that cost change is, except for the engineers, no offense, would come in and say, that's gonna be really expensive to go through all that change. I know that, but over time, is that a less expensive or more expensive program? And as we go into a decade from now, we start saying we want to measure the carbon emission cost associated with our public right of way. Right? We're going there. So if I have more cars on it, it's more expensive because I'm polluting my neighborhood. But what if I make it one lane, make it 8 miles an hour, put in a bike lane, I have more people using pedestrian, it's safer for the kids to walk, all that stuff. Yes, there's some more infrastructure cost, but there's less carbon cost. How do we start to get to that level of discussion? You've got the data now.
I think it's just knowing what are all the ifs, like.
Right.
Like what are all
And
those
for
different.
me,
The time, yeah.
the time impacts your averages. Yeah, this isn't about having the perfect answer. This is about informing the thought process of how do we shift our transportation model incrementally and understand the impact, not just to the person using it, but also to the long-term budgeting and maintenance of it. Because if I always go back to people say, rain garden, yeah, rain gardens are great.
Rain gardens are pain because they take people. Well, okay. How much do people cost? How much does it cost to go do that? Again, yeah, one rain garden is not that big of a deal, but if we said we're gonna put a rain garden in every street, all of a sudden our costs would be really expensive. So what's the average cost for someone to go spend 3 hours to go clean up a rain garden, right? And put that number in there because then it helps us understand that context as we try to, again, understand all these dynamics that are shifting through time. And people are asking for change. But we have to balance that incremental adjustment, knowing that structural change takes time. And it is expensive, but we want to understand kind of that incremental shift, which again, for me, is like, if we say 8 miles of brick, great, 8 miles of brick, that's fine. Let's just bake it in here and say, again, I'm a firm believer. If someone else says, hey, we want to add brick to our street, okay, what's that incremental cost? Let's figure out how you're gonna help pay for it, right? Yeah, that's fine. But again, right now, we're still down in the weeds. And I'm trying to bubble it back to understand at a higher level, how we understand the overall financial model of cost associated with all of these pieces, right? 11,000 street trees. What does that mean, right? And what if I put a street tree here, I know it's gonna mess up the sidewalk and therefore it's more expensive, right? But if I put a tree 6 feet away from the sidewalk, well, now I'm not messing up the sidewalk. So there is an incremental benefit to placing things in certain locations, right? And there's costs associated with putting things in certain locations. Therefore, how do I, again, it's never gonna be perfect. I don't expect it to be, but I expect to be informed about the long-term cost of the decisions we're making today associated with a public right of way, right? Because that's ultimately, these long-term carry costs that we are committing the future community to without necessarily understanding what those costs are. And we're never going to know them perfectly, but we can at least understand contextually and think about it and try our best to be informed and provide them the capacity to maintain the infrastructure we're saying we want.
It still feels like, you're like, I don't know, is it how much guy I'm going, how would I solve this problem? And it feels like need the cost of I'll call it building blocks, Market Pond with brick streets, but the building blocks say, okay, you pick some scenarios and say, at least this is just the first pass of this thing. Go back and say, okay, you think about, I'm building a menu and saying, I want to put this sidewalk here and this one. Well, we have to know the cost of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I feel like we're looking at, 2.9 million as opposed to going, yeah, but what's the cost of a brick street with a sidewalk? What's the cost of a brick street with 2 sidewalks?
Right.
What's the cost of half a brick street? So I feel like half a dozen or dozen scenarios from, a Gateway to go give us something. Your point, not trying to micromanage, but just what are our costs for these various scenarios might help us figure out as we're going forward.
We have to do that any year anyway, as part of the budget exercise. What Andrew's talking about is it becomes a planning tool for long-term planning. It becomes, if we are going to maintain our roads at a certain standard, here's what we should be prepared to spend on a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year basis. That gives you the ability to start planning. Well, how do we do that? Do we need to increase fees? Do we need to think of taxes a different way? Do we need to create different agencies for us to do this? And then we have to do this as part of the budget exercise every year anyway, because every year we have to do a plan that says, here are the roads that we're going to fix to either forward this plan or accomplish this. And we're ultimately going to have a bundle of what we can spend, which may or may not equal that annualized number.
To me, that's a different question. That's the question here on whatever page it says to say, what's our cost for a 60 PCI versus 65 versus 70? That's that question, as opposed to the other question is to say, well, how do we want the streets to look? What's our goal to say by 2042, we want to have X number of streets have sidewalks or what do you want to wear with it? that's why I feel like those are
They're
two good
different.
questions, but two very different
Yeah,
questions.
great.
I
agree.
I think, I mean, this is one area where I don't wanna say a broader policy. Generally, I think policies are best when they have a little bit of prescription and certainly teeth for, how to apply things, but I think the idea of a policy like this, certainly as Andrew, I think, has vocalized it in the past, is it gives us something to say, this is what we believe our streets should be, how they should be maintained, what level they should be maintained. We recognize we're not there now, but we will get there in a certain period of time, and this is what we need to set aside to do it. We are always gonna have to have that annual conversation.
Sure.
And I think that becomes a policy that says, this commission right now, as we sit here, believes that this is what we should do with our roads, or a complete street, putting numbers to a complete streets policy.
But here's one to say, if our vision is, we want our roads to be a 70 PCI. And we can see here, this is a number, an
Right,
estimate,
here's the
whatever.
number, yeah.
Again, that's a different question to say,
And what?
we want to have X number of
Yes.
years down the road, we want to have, one-way streets or more brick streets or less brick streets. That I don't see quantified in here how to get there. And that's where back to the pieces to go. What's the, we've talked as a commission to say, try to encourage residents to have more sidewalks. How do we get there? What's the cost of that? Do we as commission want to fund that or not? What's that gonna cost?
And what's the additional carry cost of it?
Oh, right, but I'm just saying, I don't think we have enough data from that yet. But that's a different question than the other question.
Yeah, no, and they're both important, right? Again, I'm a firm believer, right? We need to pick a number. And then you guys need to effectively manage to that PCI square. And brick and asphalt combined, all the streets, you figure it out, you guys know how to get there and how to do it as, the best way possible and keep it there. Great. That's for me, a policy level decision. We say we want 8 miles of brick and we want a 65 PCI square on average over time. And if it's above that, great. If it's not, something's wrong, right? Why aren't we getting those numbers? Why aren't we consistently funding at the level to keep it there? But it's also, again, for me, it's also the sidewalk and the curb and the stormwater and the trees, the whole public right of way. Because the public right of way is changing, right?
That's the important thing to remember.
Yeah, it's
Very much changing.
we are at the end of a cycle where everybody says car is it. It is changing. And we aren't going to change overnight, but there is going to be a pattern of expectation where less car, different modes of mobility, and we need to have the context within which we can say, this is how we change over time.
So Andy,
Right.
could I ask that we put that conversation on a future public discussion? So I want to move that forward. I also want to kind of finish this and make sure they have what they need.
Yes.
But I want to have that conversation, it's just longer than 5
Yeah.
I think this is just not one pass, it could be 6 more, but I think this is good to
Yeah,
have these
Because I
conversations.
have more questions about these calculations, but I want to have that conversation too.
Yeah, and I would love to have this, because I actually built a model. To at least get this conversation started at a higher level.
Nice.
So I would like to dive in.
It's the old change is coming whether we want it or not. It doesn't make any difference. If you go to other cities, it's already changed. I mean, it just is. There isn't much choice. People ride bikes everywhere and they ride their kids on the bikes to school. It's craziness. Boston, perfect example. Just, but it is.
Yeah.
It's amazing and it's a snowy city and that's the way they get around. And they're lucky if they have one car in the family.
Commissioner Rainey, you have some
Oh, yes.
questions? You
So-
want-
Do you want to look at any other slides?
Yeah, can we look at one of the bar graph slides, maybe the 60 PCI budget scenario results?
Yeah, this is really
That
interesting.
one's good. Yeah, sure. That one's good. Let's look at that. So what's the calculation or what's the assumption for the total lifespan of full depth asphalt and brick in this model? You had to assume, because in 20 years, I would assume,
So what we have typically done is that on the full depth asphalt streets, once they're full depth asphalt. And we ran through a life cycle, I think on the Parkway analysis after we got those. We usually rejuvenate the year after, we do the rejuvenator treatment, and then we do crack sealing a few years after that. And then it usually around year 20 or 20 to 25, I think we usually figured year 20, we do a mill and overlay.
okay.
And then
for
there's-
that, They get mill and
They
overlay.
get milled and
in year
overlaid
20.
in the future years, and then usually it's every 20 years thereafter, we're milling and over.
So there's no more full depth asphalt reconstruction that you're aware of with this, we've only been doing it for how many years, but eventually at some
So
point. in time,
we're
how many-
43 years into it so far, and the streets that were full depth reconstructed 43 years ago have not been full depth.
So that's why I get so confused. We have so many full depth asphalt streets. Why are they not staying pretty much in the green in 60 years? Not 70, let's go to the
Because the
61.
surface still deteriorates.
Well, but that's cheaper though, to mill and
Right,
overlay, it's so
exactly.
much cheaper.
Right, and that's how our program was structured
Okay,
15, 20 years ago to flip. So instead of spending as much money on reconstruction, you're spending more money on mill and overlay over a period of time.
So on that 70 PCI, well, this is 70.
then let's go to 60 or 65, one of the ones where it looks worse, because that's the mill and overlay, is so much
60 is gonna look
cheaper.
It's just that, yeah, with the funding, with the 70, you could see
Does the model factor
See
in?
the 70, there's less of the marginal and failed, obviously. And when you look here, there's more, it's just that the mill and overlay, there becomes every 20 years, you're milling and overlaying those full depth streets.
Yeah.
And there's just more to do on the mill and overlay side, but they're not, it's easier to do that.
Uh-huh.
It's just that we're saying that the difference between the 65 budget and the 70 budget was that the mill and overlay number went up.
Yeah.
So we were
more
doing
mill
milling and
overlay.
overlaying, so that way we could keep those full depth asphalt streets
At a higher
at
level.
the higher
Yeah.
level.
So that's all factored into these calculations, that those full depths will never have to be reconstructed, they just have to be mill and overlaid every 20 years.
They never have to be reconstructed?
Crazy.
Well, as
Not
of
that
right,
we know of, right?
yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not
just
saying
curious.
never is never, I mean, there
Yeah,
never is
sure.
a long
Yeah.
time, but
Yeah.
as of the 43 years of history that we have, they've not.
They don't have to.
they've
That's
not
interesting.
had to be
Really, the reason that they were
And it's
reconstructed. is because of
Drainage and
drainage,
base,
right?
like usually, as long as you have drainage under the road, which we build into the
I'm
full
married
depth
to an
streets.
engineer. I got the drainage.
So as long as, you're only as good as your base, so as long as the base is good, then you're,
We talked about
yeah.
Drainage.
So, but on the brick side, what we look at there is, so on the bricks, if they're reconstructed, then the only thing we're doing is we're on the reconstructed brick streets. We factored that after, I think it was like 20 years, we might maintain 10% of the brick surface again or something
With repair,
with repair,
Right.
not reconstruction again.
so 20 years, you might
And then-
repair 10%.
And then I think I have to look back at the
Yeah.
notes that I have, but I think then after another 10 or 20 years, I think it was maybe we repair another 10 or 15%. And then we had that kind of factored into that
Yeah, sure.
analysis when
Okay.
we were looking at, and we did this too, when we looked at the life cycle costs
Mhm.
between brick and asphalt. We had a side-by-side comparison of all the brick costs, all the asphalt costs, and what we took it to 60 years, we took it to 100 years, we took it to 200 years, just
Yeah,
in the insane. And then we said, okay, what is that comparison? Does brick ever catch
it was
up?
a break even, it was no, but.
It
gets
it
close.
never broke, it never caught up, but it got closer.
So the lifespan of a brick street, did that factor into the calculation?
Well, it factors into the maintenance
It's
activities
for
that are done.
maintenance,
Yeah.
but not for lifespan, because you just are gonna, you're gonna reconstruct it when it has to be reconstructed, and we already have the current
It's same
PCIs for
with-
all of our bricks, so we have some idea when that is.
And what we looked at, like Keith said earlier, is that we usually say like, if it's bad, just let it, don't try and
Yeah,
Band-Aid something that's bad because you're just
Yeah.
wasting
Yeah.
money.
A lot of ice.
So we let the bad go bad and then reconstruct the bad and
Yeah.
maintain the ones that can be maintained. So that's the way we kind of factored that
Yeah.
in.
Yes, there's more discussion to occur to try and tie off this segment today. I mean, my take coming away from hearing from commissioners, to me, three questions. What are our streets going to look like in 2042?
Yeah.
So question one is, what's our target? OCI's for? And the other is, what's our vision for what we want those streets to look like?
Mhm.
You know, and I think that's, we need to think about those questions. You know, some we got for target OCI, we've got some here from Gateway. I think the other piece, Commissioner Flynn's question going, what, to go back to Gateway and say we need some costing ties into what's the vision? Commissioner Spire also talked about,
Yeah.
look at Boston, look at what they do.
Yeah.
I think we need to maybe think about that to give,
Mhm.
we want, we can't predict the future, but to get some
Yeah.
sense of,
In some sense.
well, if we think it's gonna be X, what's the cost of X?
Yeah.
So we can be trying to have a funding map.
Sure.
This is so useful though, like now I know if we keep spending our 2.9 million a year, we'll get a PCI of 6, we should get something around a PCI of 60 in 20 years. That doesn't factor in utility work, so it should be a little higher, it should be maybe 62 or 65 if we get lucky,
Yeah.
but that's where we'll
You
be
can't count on
in
that,
20.
yeah.
If we just keep doing the same thing, but now we factor in 8 miles of brick that we're going to preserve as brick. So that's our do nothing
It'll
scenario.
keep the deterioration.
And also
from going
recognize-
Beyond that.
Yeah.
Right. So it'll continue to
79.
deteriorate. It'll get
And
lower
right
than
now, yeah, we're
60.
at 79, our asphalt's at 85.
Yeah, what I'm saying is average score
Yeah.
approximately is about 79.
Exactly.
So if we say 60, it means that in 2042, our average score is gonna be lower. We're comfortable with that, not, I mean, we want to set aside to spend. You know, that's again, part of those questions that.
Yeah.
you know,
And keep in mind this last year, and I know we gotta go, but this last year, the asphalt prices really went up high this year, so you're getting, because of the oil and everything else.
What
And
kind of new brick?
And, and what we've seen over the last 10 years, the 2.1 million, we used to get over a mile done for 2.1 million. Now we're like 0.9 miles that we're getting. So each year you're getting less linear footage done for the same dollar. So that continues for the next 20 years. So that,
And beyond.
and beyond, and that 2.1. It's good.
Yeah.
Now, valid point, now a question of. To Commissioner Flynn's point about the total cost of the street, so we can talk about. You know, 1 mile or 0.9 a mile. And the 2.1 versus 2.9, I think Commissioner Rainey talked about. It's not just the 2.1, you have to factor in 2.9 because it's got the curbs, the sidewalks, everything else. So now you're talking about cost of concrete as opposed to cost of blacktop versus cost of brick. Maybe it's not gonna decay that fast. What I mean by that is, you know, once you factor in, I don't know, maybe the cost of trees can be much more expensive 10 years down the road. But I mean, my point is, you should look at, my opinion, not based on the 2.1 number, which is just the street. It's the 2.9 because now you have all these other cost factors in there. And help us with that, to say with all those other cost factors in there, what's your best guesstimate? What those costs are gonna be going forward?
Well, there's a lot of kind of things that circle around to get me to this point. I think this is an interesting use case, right? It's the kind of the public right of way. Right, but
Yes.
if you go back 80 years and we clear cut all the trees, right?
Mhm.
And we said, we should have trees. We say, yeah, that's great. How much you gonna spend on trees? Well, we're gonna spend so much on trees. We're gonna spend this much every year. They didn't say, well, we need to budget for when we're gonna have to cut all these trees out. Right? But if someone would have said, hey, you know, we need to think about 60 years from now, when all these trees are matured and they're ripping up sidewalks and they're tearing up the storm sewers and they're messing up the streets and people are gonna have to go repair all this stuff. People would have said, oh, yeah, we need to think about how do we fund that? But they didn't, right? So now we're like, how much should we spend on trees? And we're like, well, we've got about 600,000. How much should we spend? Well, that's a different discussion. Right? So we're never gonna get there, right? But what is the delta? What should we be spending to get our public right of way the way it should be? Because then at least we understand what the delta is. This isn't about how good we're doing. Everybody does a great job. But what are we missing because we're not taking into account where we're trying to go and what that delta really looks like. And be honest about it, right? Let's have an honest conversation about, oh, you know, trees or stormwater or whatever it is. What is the honest delta that we're leaving behind? Because we went up to the next project and we wanted to have a new toy, right? As opposed to fixing the fence or whatever it is, right? There's always those items that get left behind. So how do we start to account for that total cost? So that we're not, you know, leaving the next generation going, wow, we're behind, right? And we're gonna have to jack taxes way up. Because again, to Commissioner Swaggart Wilson's point, right, cities are changing, but we also have, and we're in a very good place for our infrastructure. But we are still an aging community, right? And we have to attract the next generation, right? So our taxes have to be reasonable, but we also have to have quality infrastructure, which means we have to rip out things we've got and put in new stuff to create that perception, whether it's the new park, stuff or the new rec center stuff. But how do we carry that cost, knowing we are an aging community? So again, it goes back to, let's at least do our best to understand what the delta is.
So Commissioner Flynn, do you want that information before we talk about what PCI we're gonna target to budget for in the future?
PCI is ancillary to me. It's a secondary issue. It's almost, if you said 65, I'd say sure. 65 is great.
That's $600,000 a year we have to come up with.
Well, but that's a good thing to know for when we budget.
Right.
And I think we're running out of time to say, what's the questions for the next session of this to say, Commissioner Flynn saying, okay, OCI is not as important to him as perhaps other commissioners feel that way. You talk about the Delta, so we're giving Gateway homework for the next time we talk about this.
And us homework to think about it.
Mine is much simpler than yours. It says have Andrew talk to Matt.
I think there are certain variables to do this that we have to factor in. We can't do like a variable thing.
Yeah,
We have to
yeah.
choose a PCI, and as it is, we have to choose a time frame.
Yeah, we make some
That may be-
assumptions.
Yeah.
Right.
Gonna have to. And also what we think the roads are gonna look like. I mean,
That's what.
Yeah, that's.
are we narrowing roads?
That's the mission.
If you give
That's part of
options, we can put prices or
Yeah.
leads to those options. I just need to know what
Yeah.
options we wanna.
Do it.
It's the menu of options,
Yeah.
Commissioner Parker also said, what's it gonna look like? Like, well, what does it cost? You know, 3 trees versus 5 trees. Well, what is the cost of that?
Right, we need to
You know,
know,
I
you said,
think-
what should it be? We need to know what it should be.
Yeah.
In order to get to that.
Tell you.
Right,
Us with
right.
the-
So like
Parameters that you can calculate it.
Exactly,
You
we
can't
can't
go
get
through
there
and say,
without.
cost of our one-way streets everywhere, you know.
I'm gonna-
It's
I need the creative, like.
All it's down, drain it.
Exactly.
Then you take.
I'm gonna say how big, how many houses, but I really am so impressed with this work. Thank you, Matt and Rudy. This is some really great work. 60, 65, 70. We're already gonna, hit 60 in 20 years. Now we know what we're doing. It's a very, very, very important step. And if we do nothing, now we were informed.
Right.
So,
Right.
all right,
Yeah.
so let's let that be the stock for that. Thank you very much. And to be continued, we only have a couple of stuff. Anybody real quick, boards and authorities, have anybody?
Sure, I went to Shaycog, go me a good gold star, and Shaycog is talking about their waste management and trash management, and recycling management contracts. Those are their bids are being created now, and do you know the date on that, Keith, when they'll be, when we have to have that done by, when the bids will be back, I think to select?
Well, we haven't finalized the bid specifications yet.
Right,
So I think we were trying to get the bid out, get the bids back by early summer, so that we would have enough time from a budgeting standpoint,
and then when does it take effect, though? When's the contract out?
2024.
The beginning, is it January 2024?
January 1, 20.
Okay, so next year, January 2024, it looks like the bid specs are gonna be a little different, and I wanted to, give commission an update, or is
Yeah,
Keith already
Do
gonna
that.
talk about an update a little bit? Okay.
I assume we're gonna have multiple discussion sessions where we talk about the
That's
travel
fine.
contract bids and so forth.
I have that listed for a future discussion session.
Okay, I'll save it, so we have a little more time to have
big.
questions that we might wanna have or whatever.
Yes, I
Okay.
want the commission to have a chance to put their 2 cents worth.
And then Historic Preservation Board met, and they are talking still a lot about the board realignment, and we talked a lot about that, and they're also thinking about what they can do in the next 14, 15 months, maybe a small educational event for the community.
All right, cool. Anybody else?
Community Relations Board looking very forward to having Keith and Jason come talk to them. So
Great.
that's
All right,
it's a
cool.
big thing moving forward.
Beautiful.
Library's doing well looking into board training.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's good because
Yeah.
I don't know what all the library regulations are now. Now I'm on the board.
Anything else? Anybody else? Any-
School board, the search for superintendent is progressing with the consultants they hired to help. They seem pretty happy so far. And the board is putting together next year's calendar, which they are thinking will include a full week off for spring break, which is different than
I saw an email or a Facebook post that said it's out. I haven't looked at it though.
when was that?
This afternoon.
Oh, interesting.
Exciting times. We gotta check our email.
Are we gonna ask
Yeah.
the full week or- Yes to the full week or no to the full?
I didn't look. I just saw this as I scrolled past.
No, that's not for this year, next year.
Next year.
They-
Um, so for me, let's see, parking meets next week, pension is meeting soon. Connect has an executive committee meeting, Thursday. EDC meets Friday, so
All right,
everything's coming up.
awesome. All right, great. We will stop there and see you next month. Thank you.